Again, I want to thank Mike Yeager, Tom McIntyre, Lauren Hunt of NYU DC, because without them, this wouldn't be happening. Okay, I first crossed paths with Bob Perciasepe at the start of the Clinton administration. That's when he was named as EPA Assistant Administrator for Water. That was 1993. Oh my God. Then
a mere 24 years ago.
A mere 24 years ago, that's right. It's really amazing to be working in this town for that long. So in 1998, President Clinton appointed Bob as EPA Assistant Administrator for Air and Radiation, so he had all the fun of the Clean Air Act. Bob worked at the National Audubon Society during the administration of President George W. Bush, and he returned to government in 2009 when President Obama named him as number 2 at EPA as the Deputy Administrator. Right now, Bob is president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. A lot of us are familiar with this nonprofit. It works on practical policy and action on energy and climate change. So Bob, you've been through presidential transitions. Oh dear, okay. Don't move too fast though.
Thanks, Cheryl.
Yeah. Can you give us some perspectives about this transition, maybe compared to the things that you've been through? We've had discussion here today that this is different.
Well, I only have been through one transition, and that was going from Clinton to George W. Bush. I stayed until the last day then, and there was a robust transition.
What do you mean by robust?
There was a lot of interaction between the agency and the transition team. So I have no knowledge of any details on the transition this time in terms of what they discussed or didn't discuss between the staff and the transition team. I understand, I didn't hear him, but I understand Myron, who was in charge of that process, was here earlier. So I don't have a sense of how deep they went into it. The view that I have is that they are probably not as briefed up as they might have been, at the beginning, and that's the same, it seems, everywhere.
So what's it like to come into an agency as an appointee?
Well, it's, if you have some knowledge, for me coming in the second time as the deputy administrator, I was pretty knowledgeable in the agency. I had worked there for 8 years, 8 years before that, and knew, on several, as you just pointed out, several of the major programs. So it was a little easier, but you had to catch up with what the current activities were and the budget processes, and you jump into that fairly quickly, and those are high priority items.
I don't know how quickly you were confirmed. I forgot to look that up. When you both came into the Clinton administration and the Obama administration, how much of a lag was it? I'm interested about that budgeting thing because, they're saying that the Trump administration will have a budget in April, possibly March, but I don't know that all the assistant administrators will be in place by then.
The chances are high that they won't be. Mm-hmm. And so the budget will probably deal with stuff at a pretty high level. For me, in the Clinton time, I was appointed and confirmed fairly quickly. I think in the '93 time frame, probably by the late spring. Mm-hmm. But keep in mind, the president almost always does a State of the Union address sometime in February, which is weeks after inauguration. This time I think it's going to be February 28th. Mm-hmm. It's not practical that you're going to have all the people in place at that time, and I don't think anyone ever does. Usually the cabinet is in place, but not the next levels down. Sometimes the deputy is. So it was interesting talking about Senator Murkowski and the vote on the committee for Governor Perry, and I've gone through that process 3 times, and every time I came out of committee unanimously. I just like to say that, just for fun.
No brag, just fact.
But it took 9 months almost for me to get final confirmation in the Obama administration, because even though I was voted out of committee unanimously, I was held up on the floor during the debate on the Waxman-Markey bill, so I didn't become confirmed until Christmas Eve. So it gives you an indication of how things have started to change over time from the 90s to even just 8 years ago, the difficulties in getting confirmations. And I believe when I was the acting administrator and worked on getting Gina confirmed, that was the last confirmation at EPA in the second term. No one else was confirmed.
That's right. That's right. So you had some more notes there, and I didn't want to cut you off from what you were going to say.
Well, I could go on for, I can talk longer than Scott. I just want everybody to know that. But, well, I wanted to set some context for the transition and some of the questions you already heard, because there are many things going on, and I think the previous speaker, Scott Siegel, really talked about a number of them, but I think it's worth putting that in context to what we're going to be looking at in the next couple of years or even in the next couple of months. There's a pretty strong foundation that's in place of activity. Some of them are market-based, some of them are policy-driven. I think it's a mix of those two things. Sometimes the policies can help accelerate or slow down. I can't move my arm, I think. This being an Italian and not being able to move my arm is going to be a dilemma. So I think that from the foundation, you do have, in the electric sector, as we've already discussed here, you do have renewables making a big push. In the last 3 years in the United States, of new electricity generation created, renewables were number one all 3 years.
That's right.
Natural gas is a close second, but renewables are number one, and so you have a declining emission, carbon emissions coming on from electric generation. And transportation, while it's now more than electricity, but it is declining or flat. It's not growing like it used to. The vehicle miles traveled obviously have a big impact on that. But slowly but surely, and this is a trend that I think is important to look at every once in a while, the demand or the purchasing of electric vehicles is going up. We keep thinking that it's flat, it's not growing up as robustly perhaps as renewable energy is in the electric sector. But last year, to 2016, we sold the most electric vehicles in the history of the country, and December of last year was the most ever for 1 month. And Tesla, as you know, is overbooked already for a car that hasn't even been made yet.
Do you think those trends will continue under a Trump administration?
I do. I don't see, though. I see those as independent in many ways. I think there more marketing could be done, but I think there's a growing demand for those high technology
that's what
vehicles.
I mean. This is the market acting, not a policy driving it.
Yeah. And the other thing worth mentioning, and because I want to get back to the transition too, because that's why you have me here today. But because I don't want to say I don't know too much about it, but I can tell you the kinds of things that are likely going on. But there's also things going on at what we kind of call now the subnational level, the cities, the states, and even at the business level. Google last month announced that they've achieved 100% renewable for their energy use, and they're going to keep going. They're going to make sure that it's 24/7. You have states with renewable portfolio standards, and we were, starting to worry about that a little bit. But what we've seen since the election is places like even Ohio, where they put a pause on the renewable portfolio standard. The General Assembly passed a law to extend that pause, but Governor Kasich vetoed it. So the renewable energy portfolio standard is now back in place in Ohio. We saw a flip of that situation in Maryland, where the governor vetoed a stronger renewable portfolio standard, and the General Assembly overrode that veto.
What are the political pressures that are making that happen?
I think the industry is more robust, so therefore it has a bigger voice. I think the public, by a very large margin, supports renewable energy. And so I think you see these kinds of ping-pongs going on. But we still have close to 30 states, I think that right now the number might be 29, who have renewable portfolio standards. So in addition to whatever tax incentives may be out there or declining cost and innovation that's occurring, there's also some regulatory requirements. So you've got a policy and financial incentive program that is sort of making that happen. And we all know that California and the Northeast states already have cap and trade type programs in place for carbon, and they both have declining carbon emission profiles going on in the electric generating session. You know, I would add to the conversation that you had just now with Scott on carbon capture and storage, because Kemper is a big project, and it is you know, it's like when you get out on the tip of the spear trying to break through on new technologies, there's a lot of risk being taken there. But there are other projects underway. In fact, just last month, the NRG company's Petronova plant in Texas has started operating, and it's operating successfully. And people are starting to look at more ways to use the carbon, not just use it for oil, enhanced oil recovery, which still gives you a net reduction, but is problematic. So, in terms of the fact that you still have carbon going up. So you've got these things underway, and some of these things, and I guess I will play off Scott again, because I think he alluded to the fact that there could be bipartisan support for some of these things going forward in this administration. Things like extending having the tax incentives extend to things like carbon capture and storage and use. What can we do with the carbon? The advanced nuclear, or maintaining nuclear fleets, which are our largest zero-emitting electricity now. And we also have potential for an infrastructure program that could look at charging for electric vehicles or smart grids. And so there's a lot of opportunity, but it's in this phase that the policy arena is going to be challenged, and we're probably going to see, you know, some setbacks and rollbacks there.
I'm interested what this would mean in the, we went to the subnational level and the national level. I want to go into a world level about China and China's efforts on renewable energy. And if the United States opts out for whatever policy reasons or cuts back, what's that going to mean? Maybe for the rest of the world? Does this give China a chance to become even more of a world leader in this?
I think China is a major competitor of the United States on every front. And in technology and innovation is clearly one of those fronts. And I've been to China, and I've been on country road, you know, mountainous roads in China, and stuck behind trucks hauling wind generator equipment up the mountain. So, you know, it's a part of almost everyday life there. I do know that they are also moving ahead quickly on nuclear energy, and that has other big geopolitical, strategic manifestations. But China's committed to reducing their pollution problem, and if they're like any other place, they're going to look for the cheapest and best ways to do that. And if it gets carboned out at the same time, they're going to leverage that into global leadership.
Great. At this point, I'd like to ask our microphone people to come here, and if you have questions for Bob, to please line up. All right. Do we have a microphone here? Okay. Thank you, Robert. Okay, Robert needs a replacement. Is there an SEJ member? Jim, could you do this? Thanks.
What happened to Tim? He was doing such a good job.
Okay.
I'll be the holder. I'm the holder.
Yep. Okay, we'll start over here.
Hey, Marcia Johnston, Earth Steward Associates. There's been a lot written about folks abroad and in the United States and Canada really trying to lock down data, EPA data, USDA data, NOAA data. I just wondered if you had a sense from either your contacts in EPA of whether they see this as a real threat, that data collection, that this administration will not have a commitment to data collection going forward?
I think there's definitely cause for concern, although it's hard to say what really will happen and how do you parse out what people are afraid of happening and what would really happen. This is something that I'm going to say this, you're going to have to verify this with somebody who's an expert on federal records, but I believe all that data is a federal record. And we all know what the issues about federal records are in our recent history with emails, right? So I believe, government collected data, unless it's classified, is a part of a public record. And so it should be FOIable, it should be, I mean, now hiding it and making it difficult to get is just, it makes no sense, but it could happen. But it should be still available. That's my view, but I think a legal expert would have to give you that view. They'd have to put it someplace where it could be FOIA'd or something.
Do you think they will stop or reduce collection?
Again, that's a possibility. They're looking at budget cuts. They may try to use budget cuts to do that. It's hard to tell what they're going to do until we see what the budget is. I hear all kinds of rumors, as you might imagine, about what might happen or not happen at EPA, and it's very difficult to. Well, let me say it may be easy to want to fall into that trap, but I think it's definitely a cause of concern. There's enough. What do they call it? There's enough smoke or noise that there may be something to worry about. But I think we have to really see what happens when the budget comes out. As you were just mentioning, Cheryl, the budget's due out sometime in the next month or so, because I think they usually have to get it up there around the time they do a State of the Union address, although they may not have to follow that precisely. It's not in the Constitution. But there is a continuing resolution that ends in April, so they'll have to figure out whether to extend that or actually have a budget. I'm going to guess they're going to have to extend it because I don't see them going through the entire budget process by then. But I could, so I think we'll have to see what happens in the budget. But I think the cause for concern is real, and I think that there are many scientists that are out there doing exactly what you said.
Okay, I have a question over here.
I'm Annalee Grant. I cover the EPA for S&P Global Market Intelligence. So there have been there's been reports of leaks from inside the agency and employees that are deeply unhappy with Trump's plans for environmental policy. I'm wondering, can they do anything to fix that relationship once they're in place? Or are the differences in opinion so great that they won't be able to come together and work on the EPA's mission? And given what happened to, say, Sally Yates for standing up against the immigration order, could there be a purge of staff coming?
Yeah, the Sally Yates thing is a pretty complicated matter, and I don't want to really comment on that. But let me just say, you're talking about the relationship between the political leadership at EPA and the employees. EPA employees, and I can tell you this probably with as much authority as almost anyone, are a highly dedicated and public service-oriented group of people. And anyone who's asked me a question about what they should do, I've said, you need to stay and you need to provide your expert advice to the incoming team, because they have to listen to you. They're going to have to go through whatever the processes are that you have to do to make these changes. And so those processes are going to require the expertise of the people at EPA. Now, I have seen nothing to change my opinion that EPA employees should lean into trying to provide the best advice they can to help move things forward. Now, what I'm going to be looking for is and Scott alluded to this to a certain extent, if they're not going to do, the EPA is required to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. There's already 2 Supreme Court decisions that said they need to do that. The question is how. And I'm the first to admit, having been in the middle of doing regulatory process, that there are many different ways to do it. And so how is really the question much more than if. And if EPA decides to not do it, which was one of the options you talked about, Seth, in the previous panel, I think that they will be sued, and then the court will put them under some kind of schedule to do it. Now, what they do and how they do it, my hope and aspirations would be that they would be informed by the experts at EPA on how to do it. So I think it's important for the EPA employees to provide that expertise to whatever political team comes in, because that is what they took an oath to do when they became a federal employee. Now, that said, if they never have their, if they're not listened to, even if they didn't listen to me when I was there, or I didn't listen to them when I was there, you know, that will strain the relationship. But I think going in, they should have that attitude.
Thank you. We have a question over here.
Zulai, NYU student. Thank you for being here today. So I asked a similar question earlier, but received a rather dissatisfying answer. So you mentioned transportation trending towards electric, and which is great, and vehicle pollution is decreasing, which is also great. But based on your experience and insight, at what point will our focus turn towards the largest contributor of global climate change, water usage, methane emissions, deforestation, and land use change, which is animal agriculture? When will we address the #1 threat to our environment?
Well, when you pile up the emissions in the United States, agriculture is not #1. You know, electricity and transportation are the top two. Together, those two are over 50%, or right around 50% of the emissions. And then all the other things you mentioned are the other 50%. So it's not like they're unimportant. But I can't, the issue of land use in the United States is often a local issue, and it is something that regions, counties, and cities can work on to make land use more efficient so that you have fewer trips in cars or fewer vehicle miles traveled. But on the technology front, I'm a pretty high on optimism that the 50%, that is from transportation and electricity, we can make we know how to do it. The substantial progress. And some of that will filter into agriculture and how you move agricultural products around the country, whether you're not, there's no doubt that you have to tighten up the natural gas distribution system to reduce the amount of methane leaking from it.
Sorry, I'm just looking at an FAO report that puts animal agriculture at 18% of greenhouse gases and all transportation combined at 11 to 13.
Is that worldwide?
I think the issue is global versus U.S.
Yeah, that's probably, I apologize. I'm thinking of the United States, you're thinking of the world. And the world is an important place because that's what we have to make it happen at.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next question. That's you.
Oh, it's me. Sorry.
Please
Waiting
identify
for a
yourself.
dramatic pause. Hi, my name is Erin Dorman. I'm a freelance writer based out of upstate New York. I guess there's been sort of part of this talk has been, I guess, hope or expectation that the Trump administration or government bodies will defer to sort of procedural norms and the expectations. But I don't know, I don't think this is playing devil's advocate. If, say, the Trump administration's ultimate goal is to remove the EPA or neuter it, I guess, what pressure, what can the EPA do, I guess, to push back or defend, I guess, its own internally, its own almost reason for existence. Like I guess in relation to what you were just saying about how they will have to defer to the EPA's expertise. How can the EPA? What are some ways the EPA can even, I feel like, justify, because they may have to, sort of their role in acting on environmental protection?
It's a pretty fundamental question. And, you know, the political leadership that comes into the agency doesn't have to defer to the employees. I'm just speculating that they would be silly not to listen to what the employees' expertise can help them do. Whatever they decide to do, there are different ways to solve different problems. EPA's authority is completely derived from laws that Congress passes. Congress, there's about some, I don't remember the exact number, but let me just use the number 25. There's around 25 statutes. It may be 22, it might be 28, I can't remember the precise number. They just passed a new one last year called the Revised Toxic Substance Control Act, which gave EPA a whole bunch more authority to regulate the 80,000 chemicals in commerce.
And a whole lot of deadlines to do it.
And a whole lot of deadlines to do it. Those laws are what drive EPA's work, not some other activity or what somebody dreams up on the day they come into work. It's adhering to the law. And when EPA doesn't adhere to the law, either in the schedules or in substance, outside parties can litigate and ask the judicial branch of government to tell them to do it. Some people call this sue and settle in a derogatory way, but the bottom line is if EPA doesn't meet schedules and somebody sues them to get them on a new schedule, the judicial branch actually gives everybody a break by giving them a schedule that's separate than what the legislature decided. So the key point here is going to be what happens to all these environmental laws that Congress passed? They exist, nobody has repealed them, and if EPA isn't implementing them, then someone is going to have to implement them in their stead, or the judicial branch will eventually end up requiring them to implement.
Yeah.
So this is what's going to happen, I think, over time if they completely want to stop.
And on top of that, there was a bill introduced into Congress recently. Jim Bruggers, who's at the mic there, wrote about that, to abolish EPA. But you can't really abolish EPA without like overturning the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Superfund.
You could assign those responsibilities to other agencies. You could say, all right, the Clean Air Act's going to be implemented by the Health Department, or the Toxic Substance Control Act is going to be implemented by
Commerce, maybe.
somebody else. I mean, those statutes, the EPA was created to implement those statutes. Congress over time, including within the last 12 months, have continued to enact laws for EPA to implement. So they are going to, that dynamic is, will they implement it? If they don't, somebody will sue and they'll have to implement, they'll get on a schedule. If they implement it in a way that doesn't appear by somebody's interpretation to adhere to the law, they'll be sued substantively on that. So that's what's going to happen.
Could I ask
Okay, go ahead.
a follow-up?
This is going to have to be our last question.
That's fine. If you
Okay.
ask a question.
Hey, could you quickly,
Identify yourself. For the
Andy
public.
Revkin, ProPublica. Could you quickly get at, you could choose your example from two things. From the ethanol mandate or the sort of mashup of rules on car efficiency that's like EPA and NHTSA and everything. When has the EPA ever been obliged to do something by Congress where the reaction within the agency is, damn, we shouldn't be doing this is unscientific, or something like that? Like the ethanol, let's stick with ethanol. You know, where the science, when the Friends of the Earth and Heritage Foundation agree that something doesn't work, there's a problem. And the ethanol mandates, John Upton, just read John Upton's work on that. So does the EPA ever have this ability to say, this is not scientific, we can't do this?
Okay.
Not really. You know, and this is, the ethanol is a great example of something that the agency has struggled to figure out. What Congress did there is they spliced into the law some precise amounts of ethanol that have to be put into the fuel system every year. There's no ambiguity there. It says, here's how many billions of gallons of fuel, ethanol, have to be put in there. The aspiration back in 2007, I think, or 6, when that law was passed, was that cellulosic ethanol would become more prevalent. It's there. There's about 1 billion gallons a year, if I'm not mistaken, into the system. But the 13 or 14 or 16 billion gallons of ethanol or renewable fuel that's required by law is mostly coming from corn ethanol, sugar-based fermentation. So EPA is stuck in this between a rock and a hard place. They get sued to implement those things. They finally come out with a rule. EPA tried to use a provision of the law that let them do a waiver if there wasn't adequate supply, and they defined adequate supply as, you know, in a way that probably will be litigated. So I think they can't decide to not do anything. They have to try and meet all those different mandates that might be in the law. And if they have, and I don't think they've obviously satisfied very many people if the span of interest, and if, as you pointed out, don't like it. So.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's what we have time for right now. Let's thank our speaker. Thank you very much, Bob.